The courtroom in Multnomah County didn't laugh out loud. People with that much money rarely do. They do something quieter, something worse, since they exhale through their noses, just barely, the kind of sound a person makes when they've already decided how a story ends before it does. That sound followed Keanu Reeves across the room the moment he picked up the pen. He signed slowly, not for drama. His hand had been broken twice, once on a job in Bend, once somewhere he never talked about, and cold mornings made the joints stiff. He set the pen down on the table the way a man sets down something he doesn't want to throw. Across the aisle, Cynthia Pierce Lockwood sat with her spine perfectly straight, the posture of someone who had once been told in a finishing seminar that good posture reads as power. She was 41, CEO of Lockwood Dynamics, and she was watching her husband end their marriage with all the resistance of a man returning a library book. She had wanted a fight. She had built her entire week around the idea of a fight. What she got instead was silence, and silence from Keanu Reeves had always unsettled her more than anything he could have said. Nobody in that courtroom, not her attorneys, not her father, not the bailiff who'd quietly admired Keanu's old leather jacket on the way in, had any idea that in 51 minutes the ground under Cynthia Pierce Lockwood's entire life was going to open up. This is not a story about revenge. People will tell you it is. It isn't. It's a story about what happens when a person spends 11 years deciding someone's worth from across a room and then finds out, all at once, exactly how wrong they were. To understand the 51 minutes that destroyed Cynthia Pierce Lockwood's certainty about her own life, you have to go back. Not far, just far enough. His full name was Keanu Reeves. He was 44 years old, 6'1", with the kind of quiet that made people in a room either trust him immediately or feel oddly accused by his presence. They couldn't always say which. He lived in a converted carriage house behind a property on Tumalo Road outside Bend, Oregon, the kind of place where the porch light buzzed and the gravel driveway needed grading every spring, and nobody ever asked him what he did for a living, because the answer, aircraft maintenance, seemed to answer itself. He drove a 1994 Ford Bronco with one door that didn't quite match the others. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. He kept his hair longer than most men his age, not as a statement, just because he forgot to think about it. 11 years earlier, none of this had been a secret kept from anyone. It was simply a life he lived without performing it. He had a daughter, Margaret Reeves. Maggie, to everyone who knew her, was 9 years old, with her father's stillness and her mother's sharp, watchful eyes, and she was the only subject on which Keanu Reeves would ever raise his voice, and even then, only in defense. There was a photograph on his nightstand, half curled at one corner from humidity, of a woman who was not Cynthia. Nobody who visited the carriage house ever asked about it, because something in the way Keanu looked at it, for exactly as long as it took to turn off the lamp, no longer, told you not to. He never explained it, not even to Maggie, not fully. He'd told her once when she was 6, she was somebody I worked with a long time ago. Somebody good, that was all. Maggie had never pushed. Some children understand grief by instinct before they have a word for it. Keanu and Cynthia had met 14 years earlier at a fundraiser for the Deschutes County Aviation Heritage Foundation. Of all places, an event Cynthia had attended because her father told her it would be good for visibility, and Keanu had attended because he'd helped restore the World War II trainer plane that was the night's centerpiece. She had asked him what he did. He'd told her the truth. I fix things that fly. She had found that charming back then. Charm has an expiration date, though, when it isn't backed by a number she can put on a slide. For the first 3 years, things were good in the unremarkable way good marriages are good. Small jokes, shared coffee, a kind of comfortable boredom neither of them minded. Cynthia was an associate director at a logistics firm. Keanu ran a 2-bay maintenance shop near the regional airport. They were equals, or close enough that neither of them thought to count. Then Cynthia's father, Harold Pierce, stepped down as chairman of Lockwood Dynamics and handed the company, quietly, and not without conditions, to his daughter. And something in Cynthia recalibrated, the way a compass needle swings hard when it gets close to something with enough magnetic force. Promotions became board seats. Board seats became magazine profiles. Portland Business Journal, then Forbes Regional, then eventually a six-page feature with her photographed in front of a hangar she did not own, captioned "The Woman Rebuilding American Logistics." The higher she climbed, the more she needed everyone around her to climb with her, or at least to look like they had. Keanu did neither. He didn't want to. That had once been the thing she loved about him, that he never needed the room to be impressed. By their 8th year of marriage, it had become the thing that made her flinch when someone at a dinner party asked what he did. There was a gala in Cynthia's 6th year as chairman, the Lockwood Dynamics Founders Dinner, held in the atrium of their downtown Portland headquarters, 400 guests, a string quartet, 2 senators in attendance. Cynthia introduced Keanu to a cluster of investors with a practiced smile and since she had clearly rehearsed without realizing it. "This is my husband. He's in aviation maintenance, not aircraft engineering, though that had been his degree, his training, his actual life before the shop. Maintenance. A word chosen, Keanu understood instantly for its smallness. One of the investors, a silver-haired man named Greg Aldous, had laughed, not unkindly, just reflexively, and said, "Good for you," keeping it grounded. Cynthia and the whole circle had laughed with him, and Cynthia had laughed loudest of all. And Keanu had stood there holding a glass of champagne he didn't drink, watching his wife perform her own embarrassment of him for an audience that would forget the joke by morning. He never brought it up. That was the wound nobody around him ever quite located. Not even Maggie, not even Cynthia, who spent 11 years believing his silence meant nothing had landed. It had landed, it simply hadn't made a sound on the way down. After that, the distance between them widened the way distance always does, not with a slammed door, but with 1,000 small absences. Cynthia took the 6 a.m. flights to Seattle, the 9 p.m. flights back from Denver. Keanu took Maggie to school. Keanu sat through the flu, the nightmares, the science fair volcano that wouldn't erupt on the first 9 tries. Keanu learned to braid hair from a YouTube tutorial at 7:15, a fact that, had anyone in Cynthia's circle known it, might have changed how the next 10 years went. Nobody knew it, nobody asked. By year 10, Cynthia had stopped pretending there was anything to defend. She told her sister in front of Keanu at Thanksgiving that she sometimes wondered what we even have in common anymore besides Maggie. She told her father more than once that she should have listened to him back in the beginning. Harold Pierce had never once called Keanu by his first name. It was always your husband, delivered with the same flat tone a person might use for your car payment or your allergy. The strange part, the part that would matter later, though nobody could have known it then, is that Keanu never once tried to correct the record. Not because he didn't have the means, because somewhere along the way he'd stopped needing Cynthia's circle to understand him and started protecting something else instead, a name on a hangar in Redmond, Oregon, that nobody at that founder's dinner had ever thought to look up. The filing came on a Tuesday in March. Cynthia's attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Preston Holloway, handed Keanu a stack of documents thicker than a phone book and informed him, not unkindly, that Cynthia was seeking full custody, full control of joint assets, and, this was the part Holloway delivered with the faintest curl of satisfaction, a formal court finding that Keanu was, in the filing's language, financially non-contributory to the marital estate. Keanu read the document twice at his kitchen table, the porch light buzzing outside, Maggie's homework spread across the other half of the table. He didn't call a lawyer that night. He made grilled cheese. He helped Maggie with long division. He went to bed. The next morning, he drove to the regional airport, walked past the maintenance bay where 2 of his crew were running a compressor check on a Cessna Caravan, nodded to them the way he always did, and continued past the hangar door marked Revis Aviation Solusless, a name that, to anyone glancing at it from the access road, looked like exactly what it appeared to be, a mid-sized regional maintenance operation, maybe 40 employees, nothing remarkable. It was not, in fact, 40 employees. It was 4,011 across 9 facilities in 6 states, and it was the majority owner, 6% of Cascade Air Holdings, the parent company that controlled, among other things, a regional charter fleet, 2 FAA-certified repair stations, and a controlling stake in an avionics firm in Wichita that supplied parts to half the regional carriers on the West Coast. Keanu had built it from a single bay he financed with $4,000 loan from his late mother's life insurance the year before he met Cynthia. He'd kept it quiet, not from shame, not from strategy, but because his mother had told him once, dying in a hospital bed in Eugene, "Don't let money be the loudest thing about you, Keanu. Let it be the last thing people learn." He'd taken that the way you take the last thing a parent says to you, like scripture. Cynthia had never asked a single question about the shop's finances in 14 years of marriage. She had assumed, the way people assume things about a life that doesn't perform itself, that a man who came home in coveralls with grease under his nails was exactly what he appeared to be, and nothing more. The court hearing was scheduled for the second week of April. The hallway outside courtroom 4 of the Multnomah County Courthouse filled early that morning with the particular hum of people who somewhere better to be and wanted everyone to know it. Cynthia arrived in a cream Saint Laurent suit, flanked by Preston Holloway and two junior associates carrying matching leather portfolios. Harold Pierce walked half a step behind her, the way he always did, close enough to claim credit, far enough to claim distance if things went badly. Keanu arrived alone, 11 minutes early, in a faded Carhartt jacket and the same boots he wore to the shop. A reporter from the Bend Bulletin, who happened to be in the building for an unrelated case, glanced at him, glanced at the docket sheet, and didn't connect the two names. Why would she? Inside the courtroom, Harold leaned toward his daughter and murmured, just loud enough, "Couldn't even rent a suit for the occasion." Cynthia's mouth curved. He wouldn't know what to do with one. The associates laughed, quiet, professional, the kind of laugh that has been trained never to be loud enough to draw a judge's chin. Keanu heard every word of it. He set his folder down on the table in front of him, carefully, the way a person sets something down when they are choosing very deliberately, not to think about what their hands would rather do. Judge Renata Solis entered, and the room stood, and the hearing began with the dry procedural rhythm of family court. Custody schedules, asset disclosures, the reading aloud of Keanu's modest financial statement from the maintenance shop's public filings, a document Holloway had clearly prepared to use as a weapon. "Your Honor," Holloway said, holding the page up like evidence at a crime scene, "Mr. Rivas's reported annual income from Rivas Aviation Solutions is $6,400. My client's household has, for over a decade, functioned almost entirely on Miss Pierce Lockwood's earnings and equity. We are asking the court to recognize that reality in both the asset division and the custody arrangement." Keanu's own attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Dana Whitfield, hired 3 days earlier, paid in full in cash, a detail Holloway found almost insultingly quaint, stood and said only, "We don't dispute the figures my client has disclosed, Your Honor. We'd ask the court to allow Mr. Revis 30 days to provide a complete and accurate accounting before any final asset ruling." Holloway didn't bother hiding his smile. "Your Honor, with respect, what could 30 days possibly reveal that the last 14 years haven't?" Judge Solis looked at Keanu over her glasses. Keanu looked back, steady, unreadable, and said nothing. It was the silence that finally cracked something in Cynthia. She had wanted him to argue the figures, to humiliate himself trying to defend a number that couldn't be defended. Instead, he sat there with the calm of a man who had simply decided this particular battle wasn't worth the breath. That stillness needled her more than any insult could have. She had spent a decade believing his quiet meant he had nothing to say. It had never once occurred to her that it might mean he had nothing to prove. 30 days, Judge Solis said finally, and brought the gavel down once. During the recess that followed, Cynthia's chief of staff, soft-spoken young man named Tobias Rain, who had quietly admired Keanu from a distance for years without ever saying so, found himself alone with Keanu near the courthouse vending machines. Tobias had seen the gala comment 3 years earlier. He had seen a dozen smaller versions of it since, the way Cynthia's circle talked about Keanu when he wasn't in the room, the way nobody ever corrected it. He bought 2 coffees, handed one to Keanu without a word, and said only, "For what it's worth, I always thought you seemed like a decent guy." Then he walked away before Keanu could answer, because some kinds of guilt only have room for one sentence. Keanu held the coffee a long time without drinking it. Inside the courtroom, Holloway tried a different angle once the recess ended, his voice climbing into the register lawyers use when they sense was the ground shifting under them. Your Honor, regardless of net worth, the relevant question for this court is parental involvement, and the record will show that Ms. Pierce Lockwood has been the primary financial provider for this family for over a decade. The record will also show, Dana said, not raising her voice at all, that Mr. Revis has attended 100% of his daughter's school conferences over the same period. Miss Pierce Lockwood has attended 11%. She let the numbers sit in the room the way numbers sit when nobody can argue with them. We have the school's attendance logs, Your Honor, if counsel would like to review them. Holloway did not ask to review them. Cynthia beside him stared straight ahead at a point on the wall that wasn't there, her jaw tight enough that a vein moved faintly at her temple. 11%. She had known the number would be low. She had not known it would be read aloud in a public room in a tone that made it sound less like a statistic and more like a verdict. In the hallway afterward, Harold caught Keanu's sleeve, an unusual gesture from a man who had touched Keanu exactly twice in 14 years, both at funerals. I want you to understand something, Harold said, voice low, almost gentle in the way cruelty sometimes pretends to be gentle. This isn't personal. Cynthia built something. You didn't. The court sees that. Eventually, you'll see it, too. Keanu looked at him for a long moment. 30 days, he said, and walked out into the April sun. What Cynthia did not know, what nobody in that hallway knew, not even Maggie, not yet, was that 2 days before the hearing, Keanu had received a call from a board member at Cascade Air Holdings named Priya Castellan, the company's chief financial officer, who had quietly flagged something in the public divorce filing that worried her. Under Oregon disclosure law, a controlling shareholder's marital litigation could, in certain circumstances, trigger a mandatory ownership disclosure to the company's institutional investors. Keanu, she'd said on the phone, in the clipped, careful tone she used for things that mattered. If this goes to a contested asset hearing and your attorney has to file a sworn accounting, it's not staying quiet. You understand that. The board's going to want to get ahead of it before the markets do. Keanu had sat in the Bronco in the airport parking lot for a long time after that call, looking at the hangar with his name on it, the name he'd kept small on purpose for 11 years. Do it, he'd said finally. Get ahead of it. He had not told Cynthia. He hadn't told her because some small, stubborn, unhealed part of him still wanted, after everything, for it not to matter to her how much he was worth. He wanted, one more time for the woman who'd once admired his intelligence at a charity dinner 14 years ago, to look at him and see a man, not a balance sheet. He would not get that. Nobody ever does, not really. But he didn't know that yet. The second hearing was scheduled for the second Thursday in May, and by then something had already begun to move that neither Keanu nor Cynthia fully controlled. On the Monday before, Cascade Air Holdings issued a routine SEC disclosure, 3 paragraphs buried, the kind of filing that exists for compliance and nothing else, confirming that its majority shareholder, listed as K. Rivas, was a party to pending domestic litigation in Multnomah County, Oregon. A junior analyst at a Seattle hedge fund named Marisol Ferreira, scanning filings before her morning coffee finished brewing, noticed the name, cross-referenced it against the company's ownership structure, and sent a single message to her desk's group chat. Wait, does anyone know who this guy actually is? 40 minutes later, a business reporter for the Portland-based outlet Cascadia Wire, a woman named Dana Okwosa, found the filing through a tip from a contact at the SEC desk and began making calls. By Wednesday evening, Cascadia Wire had published a 400-word piece under the headline, Lockwood Dynamics CEO's estranged husband revealed as majority owner of $1.4 billion aviation holding company. Cynthia found out the way most people find out things that destroy their week, from a text message sent by her own chief of staff at 9:52 p.m. that read only, "Have you seen this?" with a link attached. She read it standing in her kitchen, the granite counter cold under her palm, the recessed lighting humming overhead. She read it twice, then she set her phone down on the counter, face down, very gently, the way a person sets down something they're afraid of what their hands might do otherwise. Harold called 11 minutes later. She let it ring 4 times before answering. "Tell me this is wrong," he said, no greeting. I don't know yet, Cynthia said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her. You don't know? Cynthia, you've been married to this man for 14 years. I know how long I've been married to him, Dad. The words came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that Harold went quiet on the other end of the line, a silence that, for the first time in Cynthia's adult life, she recognized as something close to fear. The second hearing, 2 days later, did not resemble the first. The courthouse hallway, which had been thin with idle gossip in April, was thick with reporters by May. Cascadia Wire, two local network affiliates, a stringer from a national business outlet who'd flown in from San Francisco the night before. Cynthia walked through them with her chin level and her sunglasses on indoors, the posture of a woman determined to look like nothing had changed, undone slightly by the fact that her hands, when a reporter shouted a question at her, would not stay still at her sides. Inside courtroom 4, the gallery was fuller than it had been in April. Word travels fast in a small enough city, and a story this specific, the modest mechanic husband, the billionaire wife, the secret reversed, has a gravity that pulls people in even when it isn't their business. Especially when it isn't their business. Keanu sat at the defense table in the same Carhartt jacket. Some habits, it turns out, don't change just because the world finally knows what they're hiding. Dana Whitfield stood first this time. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your Honor, in compliance with the court's order for a complete financial accounting, we're submitting Mr. Revis's full disclosure, including audited ownership records for Cascade Air Holdings and its 9 subsidiary operations. She set a binder on the clerk's desk that was, by any visual jour, considerably thicker than anything Holloway had produced in April. We'd ask the court to note that Mr. Revis's net worth, as independently audited by Hollis and Greer in February of this year, exceeds $1. 1 billion. The gallery did not gasp out loud. Courtrooms train people not to, but the sound that moved through the room was its own kind of confession. 40 people inhaling at slightly different speeds, a small mechanical shudder of disbelief passing seat to seat. Holloway stood, sat back down, stood again. Your Honor, this changes the entire posture of the asset claim. It changes nothing about the custody recommendation my client requested in good faith, Dana said evenly. Mr. Revis is not seeking to weaponize this disclosure. He's complying with the court's order, nothing more. Keanu did not smile. He did not look at Cynthia to see how she was taking it. He sat with his hands folded on the table, the same stillness he'd carried into the room in April, and watched the binder change hands the way a man watches weather he can't control and has stopped trying to. That contrast, his unchanged calm against the visibly shifting ground beneath everyone else, was in its own way more devastating to Cynthia than if he'd stood up and gloated. If he'd gloated, she could have hated him cleanly. Instead, he sat there exactly as he had always sat, and she understood with a kind of vertigo that he had never needed her validation to know who he was. She had spent 14 years assuming the opposite. Harold, beside her, had gone the color of old paper Judge Solis called a recess. In the hallway, Cynthia found herself standing 6 feet from Keanu for the first time since the hearing began, both of them briefly abandoned by their respective handlers, who were busy fielding calls. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she said. "Not loud, not for the reporters, just for him." Keanu looked at her for a long moment. "You never asked," he said. "Not once in 14 years did you ask me what I actually did all day. You asked what I made. It landed the way the truest things land, without volume and without any room to argue. The fallout did not wait politely for the divorce to finish. By Friday morning, Lockwood Dynamics Board had convened an emergency call. 2 institutional investors, including the fund where Marisol Ferreira worked, had quietly begun pulling shares, not because of anything Cynthia did wrong as a CEO, but because of a single uncomfortable question now circulating in every group chat and earnings call in the Pacific Northwest. If she misjudged the man she lived with for 14 years this completely, what else has she misjudged? A board member named Foster Whitlock, who had championed Cynthia's chairmanship from the beginning, requested a private conversation by Monday. 2 journalists who'd previously profiled her as visionary now filed follow-up pieces with headlines considerably less kind. A planned keynote at the Pacific Northwest Logistics Summit was quietly rescheduled. None of it was a court ruling. None of it was a punishment handed down by a judge. It was simply the slow, compounding weight of a reputation built on the appearance of judgment, cracking under the discovery that the judgment itself had been wrong, repeatedly, publicly, for over a decade. Harold Pierce, who had spent 14 years referring to Keanu as your husband with the flat disdain reserved for an unpaid parking ticket, found himself, 3 weeks later, quietly removed from 2 industry advisory boards he'd sat on for over 20 years. Not for anything he'd done, but because his name had become, almost overnight, a punchline in rooms he used to control. He called Cynthia twice that week. She did not call him back either time. For the first time in either of their lives, Harold Pierce understood what it felt like to be the one waiting by a phone that didn't ring. The final custody and asset hearing, held in early June, was almost anticlimactic by comparison. Keanu did not ask for control of Lockwood Dynamics, did not ask for $1 of Cynthia's equity, did not so much as mention the word alimony. He asked only for primary custody of Maggie during the school year, generous summer time for Cynthia, and a clean, unremarkable division of the modest joint assets, the house, the 2 cars, nothing more. Holloway, visibly thrown by the absence of a fight he'd spent 6 weeks preparing for, asked Dana Whitfield afterward, almost involuntarily, why isn't he going after more? He could take the company. He could take everything. Dana looked at him the way you look at someone who has asked a question whose answer they're not equipped to hear. He never wanted any of it, she said. He just wanted to stop being underestimated by people who never bothered to ask. There was one more scene that summer that never made it into any article because no reporter was present for it, and the 2 people who were present never spoke of it publicly. In late June, Cynthia called an emergency meeting of the Lockwood Dynamics executive team to address what she called external noise around the company. Foster Whitlock, the board member who'd backed her chairmanship from the start, sat across the long glass table with his hands folded and did not meet her eyes for most of the meeting. A small thing, but Cynthia had spent enough years in rooms like that one to know exactly what it meant. I'd like to address it directly, Cynthia said, her voice level, professional, the voice she'd used in 100 meetings before this one. My personal situation has no bearing on this company's performance or my judgment as chairman. Foster finally looked up. Cynthia, he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it land harder, you spent 14 years telling this board, this industry, and frankly, this family, that you could read people, that you knew talent when you saw it, knew value when you saw it. That was the pitch. That was half the reason this board backed you over your father's other candidates. He paused. I'm not saying you're not capable. I'm saying the thing we hired isn't matching the thing we're now watching unfold in the newspaper. That's not noise. That's a credibility problem, and credibility is the only thing keeping 3 of our biggest investors from walking. Nobody else in the room spoke. A junior associate near the door studied her notepad with unusual focus. Cynthia recognized the silence immediately because she had built a career standing on the other side of it, the specific quiet of people who agree but won't say so out loud, because their mortgage doesn't care who's right. The meeting ended without resolution. 2 of the 3 investors Foster mentioned reduced their positions within the month anyway. Lockwood Dynamics stock didn't collapse, nothing so dramatic, but it drifted down 9% over the summer and never fully recovered the ground, a fact that financial analysts would footnote for years afterward as reputational drag, a phrase that sounded clinical and meant, simply, that the market had quietly decided to trust her a little less than it used to, and markets, once they decide that, rarely change their minds back. Cynthia did not cry in that meeting. She did not cry in the elevator afterward, or in the car, or in the kitchen with the cold granite counter where she'd first read the headline 2 months earlier. She simply sat for a long time in the dark of her own living room with the city lights of Portland spread out below her floor-to-ceiling windows, a view she had once worked 80-hour weeks to earn and which now, for the first time, felt like it was looking back at her instead of the other way around. The months that followed were quieter than anyone expected, and quiet, it turns out, can be its own kind of sentence. The headlines faded by midsummer, replaced by newer scandals, newer faces. The cameras stopped waiting outside the courthouse. Cascadia Wire moved on to a different story about a different fortune. But for Cynthia, the silence that replaced the noise was louder than anything the press had said about her, because in that silence she was finally alone with the only question that mattered. Not how much money Keanu had, but how completely she had failed to see the person standing in front of her for 14 years. She had built her adult life on the belief that worth could be measured, ranked, displayed. She had skipped a school play in second grade because of a board call she now couldn't remember the content of. She had missed Maggie's 7th birthday for a keynote in Singapore. She had built an empire and somehow not noticed that the man doing actual daily unglamorous work of raising their daughter was the one person in her life she'd never once asked a real question. In late August, on an ordinary Tuesday, Cynthia sat alone on a bench at Drake Park in Bend while Maggie played with two friends near the river, her laughter carrying across the grass in a way that made several strangers smile without knowing why. Keanu arrived a few minutes later to collect his daughter for the week, his Bronco idling in the gravel lot behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. No lawyers, no reporters, no binder of audited statements between them, just people who used to know each other, sitting in the long gold light of a late summer evening. "I'm sorry," Cynthia said finally. The word came out smaller than she expected it to, for all of it, for the gala, for the things I said in front of my father, for never asking. Keanu was quiet for a moment, watching Maggie chase a dog twice her size near the water's edge. "I never needed you to be impressed by what I have," he said. "I needed you to be curious about who I was." "That's a different thing." "I know that now," Cynthia said. "Knew it too late." "We both made mistakes," Keanu said, and there was no triumph in it, no edge, just the flat, tired honesty of a man who had stopped needing to win. "The important thing now is what you do with Maggie, not with me." Maggie came running up the path a moment later, breathless, grinning, and grabbed both of their hands without hesitation, the easy faith of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet learned that adults sometimes can't be in the same room without flinching. For a few seconds, neither Keanu nor Cynthia pulled away. They did not get back together. Stories like this rarely offer that. Too much had broken, too much time had been spent looking past each other instead of at each other. But something else, smaller and more durable, did happen in the months that followed. Cynthia left a board meeting early for a school recital and didn't apologize for it once. She learned to call Maggie just to listen, not to manage. She stopped for the first time in over a decade, measuring a room by who in it had the most money. Harold Pierce never apologized to Keanu, not once, not in writing, not in person. He told a colleague months later over drinks he didn't finish, "I had no way of knowing who he really was." It was in its way the most honest thing he ever said about the situation, and also the thing that revealed finally and completely that he had never once thought it was his job to find out. The following spring, Maggie stood on a small stage at her school's science fair, accepting first place for a working model of a turbine engine Farthart had helped her wire. Not built for her, helped her wire, a distinction Keanu insisted on every time someone tried to compliment the model. Cynthia sat in the third row, Keanu sat in the front. When Maggie found them both with her eyes from the stage, she didn't look surprised to see them in the same room. She just smiled, the specific unguarded smile of a child who has decided somehow that things are going to be okay. Keanu and Cynthia exchange a glance across the gymnasium, not warm, not cold, just true. Neither of them needed to say what they'd both learned the hard way, that an empire can buy you a room full of admiration, but it can't buy you the kind of trust that gets handed to you freely by someone who's watched you show up again and again on the ordinary days nobody was filming. Sometimes the people the world is quickest to overlook are the ones who were never asking to be seen in the first place, only to be known. Sometimes the life everyone assumes is small turns out to be the only one that was ever actually whole. If Keanu Revis's story stayed with you, if it reminded you that a person's worth has nothing to do with the jacket they wear or the job title a stranger assumes for them, then you already understand the lesson underneath it. Dignity was never something Keanu had to win in that courtroom. He walked in with it. He walked out with it. The only thing that changed was who finally noticed. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depth, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.